the view I have of this is to introduce the model to you mainly through watching, a lot of watching and experience. I'll talk some, and I'll try to also answer questions. That's the feedback I always get, so you don't have to bother putting that on your evaluation, is that I take too many questions. But I like to get to know you, and I like to discuss with the issues that come up as you try to learn about this. I'm going to go back in time about 30 years. Last year was the 30th anniversary at our conference of this model. So going back to when I was a lot younger, and I had come out of a PhD program in family therapy. I have a doctorate in that, marital and family therapy. And back in those days, we cool family systems people knew that we could change everything needed to change without having to focus inside. So there was, some of you are old enough to remember this big polarization between us cool systems thinkers and some of you uncool intrapsychic types. Linear thinkers, we called you back then. And so I held that belief until I made the mistake that I hope none of you do if you want to test your most precious assumptions about therapy. And I did an outcome study. And I organized about 30 bulimic kids. This was a new syndrome back then. And their families to come in. And between myself and a woman named Mary Jo Barrett, whose name you might know, we did our straight, structural, strategic family therapy and found I could reorganize the families just the way the book said to do it, and still my clients didn't realize they'd been cured, and they kept binging and purging. And it was so frustrating that I began crossing this unwritten rule, breaking that rule of don't bother asking about this stuff. And I started asking what was happening inside of them that was creating this. And they started talking about these different parts of them. They would talk about how when something bad happened in their lives, it would trigger this critic who was brutal and could call them all sorts of terrible names. And then that would bring up another part that would feel worthless and empty and alone and desperate. And that state was so upsetting that almost to the rescue would come the binge and would take them out and make them not feel much. But the act of the binge would bring back the critic, who's now calling him a pig on top of all the other names, which would then bring back that worthless, empty, alone, desperate, young part of them, which would, of course, bring back the binge. And so they were in this kind of vicious circle all day, which to me as a family therapist sounded familiar. It was the kind of thing I'd been studying with families, these circular sequences of interaction that would escalate over time and produce symptoms. So I began thinking, maybe there's a way to overlay some systems thinking, some family therapy technique to this inner system that I'm learning about. And at the time, first I thought, well, this is a nice metaphor, because I didn't know from parts at all. I thought we all had one mind and a bunch of different thoughts and emotions. But they were talking as if these things had a lot of autonomy and they could take over and make them do things they didn't want it to do. And I got scared and thought, oh my goodness, maybe these people are sicker than I thought. Until I began to listen inside myself, and oh my God, I've got them too. And some of mine are as extreme about food as theirs. And then I made the mistake of assuming they were what they seemed, because the field was thinking that way. The field basically said these are internalizations of some parental energy, or these are out of control impulses. And if you believe that about them, then you'll relate to them in a certain way, which I tried to then co-create experiments with my clients to get them to control the parts, or shut them out, ignore them, or fight with them in some way or another. Found that made it worse. They'd come back more extreme, but I was like a man in a hole with a shovel. I didn't know to do anything else because that's the way I thought of these things. So I'd say, stand up stronger to the critic when it starts to attack you. And they'd come back and say, now the names are more brutal. And it wasn't until the first client that I was aware of